Welcome, everybody, to Getting Real with Gloria, where my journey supports yours. I'm Gloria, your host, and today I have a very special guest on, Scott, who is a certified mindful coach, writer, and the host of her own podcast, Real Talk Tuesday. Welcome, Sierra. Really excited to have you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation today.
So Sierra and I met actually sort of unconventionally, or in these days, I guess conventionally. So I started following Sierra on Instagram because I saw a lot of the posts were really resonating with me and where I was in my journey. And a lot of what Sierra posts about, which we're going to dive into soon, is this idea of deconstructing your life and really asking questions about what your beliefs are and deconstructing those beliefs almost in a periodic way so that we're never sort of stuck in old conditioned ways of doing things. And we're able to live a life that's really free and gives us the ability to live richly. So I loved Sierra's post and I just reached out to her. I was like, hey, would you be willing to be on my show? And we had this great connection conversation where everything just flowed. I think we talked for like almost 2 hours or something.
Yeah, it was a while. It was great.
Yeah. And we just shared a lot. I did a lot of the talking at that time. This time, Sierra's going to do most of the talking, but I got a chance to share sort of a lot of my journey with Sierra, and it just really felt organic and natural. So I'm really excited to kind of bring her on and have you all be introduced to her and all of the really wonderful practices that she's putting into place for herself. So Sierra, tell me about how you became a mindset coach. What led you there?
Yeah, well, a handful of years ago, I was just in a really dark season of my life and was struggling with my own self-worth and within friendships and relationships. And there was a season of my life where I had called off an engagement. I was starting to walk away from the church, which was my entire sense of belonging. So many things within my life were changing, and I felt really, really lost. And there were people who I didn't know that they were coaches at the time, but there were people who I really looked up to that were writing books, that were creating content online, people that held so much value within my own life that really helped me to get unstuck from where it was that I was and to really bring me into a place where, we're always healing, but I definitely felt like through mentorship, through therapy, through coaches that I was able to experience just so much growth in my life. And I really wanted to provide that for other people. So yeah, I think that's kind of like what led me to this work. And yeah.
And what are you focused on in your work with your clients? What are clients, when they come to you, what are their struggles? What are they looking to get? And how are you assisting them?
Yeah, so a lot of it, I think it can be best summed up within the term self-sabotage, which are those behaviors that we do that kind of like get us in our own way and that can keep us really stuck. So maybe it's perfectionism or self-doubt. And for those of you who don't know what coaching is, the way that I like to describe it is coaching is a relationship where essentially we're getting really clear about where it is you're at now, where you want to be, and what are the gaps that are in the in-between. And so the gaps in between are the things that are keeping you stuck, the forms of self-sabotage that you can't seem to break out of. And in the context of coaching, we're getting really curious about those things, knowing that as we get curious with them, we can increase our own self-awareness. And as our awareness increases, we can then take aligned action. And so I think a lot of it is about self-sabotage, but I find that most particularly a lot of people, it goes back to navigating life once they've left the church. I've shared a lot of my journey, and I know we'll talk about this later on in today's episode, but that's kind of what I very vulnerably share online, and I've had a lot of people connect with me on. And so I find that that also very regularly comes up within sessions of just people not knowing how to navigate life once they've left this very clear-cut black and white system of, all these, their faith and what that looked like for them. So I think both self-sabotage and religious deconstruction are definitely the two things that come up most.
And both those things can actually sort of be intertwined together too, right? Like we can accidentally start sabotaging ourselves because we feel like we're stuck with a specific narrative or a specific belief pattern that we've had, whether it's religious or not. But those things can kind of fall together. I've found in my own journey. And I know that we talk a lot about on this channel, erasing limiting patterns and sort of looking at some of those things, maybe not even erasing them, but looking at the blueprints that we come into our young adult life with, and we're sort of programmed to follow, even if we are not aware of them, and how we can kind of begin to look at those more clearly and then break them down and decide whether we want to keep following that or not. And then taking that action plan, like you said, to live a life that's really more in line with what we want. And I'd like you to kind of talk about where that initial deconstruction started for you. Like, what were the first inklings of, hey, I want to start thinking about my life differently, and what led you to that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And also, I think you framed all that so beautifully. You're such a good speaker. So I really
Oh gosh, thanks.
hearing, like, when you like re-say things I say, I'm like, wow, that's so beautiful, you know? So yes, 100%. I would say, so I first started kind of questioning my faith a handful of years ago. Before at this season of my life, I was just in a really unhealthy relationship, and I initially went to therapy just to gain some clarity as to, what were the things going on in my life that I needed to change, because I knew where I was at, I could not stay. And it was actually in the context of therapy that I began to learn about these things that quantify a healthy relationship versus an unhealthy relationship. I began to learn about terms like narcissism and what emotional and mental manipulation is. And I say all that because what I found so interesting is that while I began to apply these things to my own personal life in different areas, I also could not help but recognize the way that those terms applied to the way that I myself had learned to relate to myself, how I had learned to relate to God, how I had learned to relate to people outside of the church, and how to how much of the things I was learning that quantified unhealthy relationships actually played a role in the way that I held relationships within my own life. And so I think, if anything, what that did for me is it started to make me question not necessarily all of my beliefs, but it made me question like the church, and like, why have we come to some of the conclusions that we've come to, and why does everything feel so black and white and binary? And is there maybe something that we're missing in the conversation? Is there more truth that's yet to be found, I guess? And I would say that was definitely a huge catalyst for me for starting to deconstruct. And then I think later down the line, like a few years beyond that, I would say I started to deconstruct actually because of my faith, and not despite it. I think people have a misconception that if you start questioning your belief system, it's because you don't really believe it.
Mm.
And for me personally, I found that I could not help but feel like I had to question my belief system because I believed in this God so deeply that it almost felt disingenuous for me to think that I actually had all the answers at that point in time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think for me, deconstruction, which is really just the peeling apart of what it is you believe and why you believe it. I think deconstruction for me was really me living out my faith in a way that probably appeared so unconventional and heretical to the people around me, but it felt so genuine because I knew that if God is truly God and the author of all truth, there was no question or answer I could find where that God is not at. And so I think through that, I just began to question denominationally, like, where do I feel most aligned with? And then I think it just kind of unraveled from there, as far as just like, I began to become aware of just in our own human knowledge, like how little we actually know about the world, but also how beautiful that is.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was kind of a long answer to your question.
No, it was a beautiful answer. And I think that having shared, I know I shared with you a lot of my personal story on my religious faith and how I was raised. I think too, depending on the shelter under which that falls. So depending on like what church you're raised in, or what religious faith you're raised in, and like what spectrum of that, because I want to make sure that everybody who's listening understands that when we're talking about deconstructing faith, when we're talking about Sierra or my experience, this is only one experience. And I want to be sure that if you are listening and you have a strong faith, we are not challenging necessarily your faith, but we are just opening the conversation to ensure that everybody feels genuinely supported and safe within that faith. And if there are any questions that arise for you, that you do explore those. But obviously every religion has its sects which are beautiful and positive and enrich people's lives, and sects which do not, and that goes for any relationship. As Sierra said, we can have healthy relationships and we can have unhealthy relationships, and the same thing goes for religion and all faith. We can do those in a way that supports us and that nourishes us, and we can also do it in a way that makes us feel guilt or shame or sort of some of these other kind of destructive behaviors that can ensue because of that. And so I'd love you to share what sort of, if you can talk a little bit about your belief system before and what you were surrounded by and what you felt during that time. And then just like how that, I'd love you to kind of like take me from the journey from like there, and then take me on the path of like the inkling questions that began to arise to where you eventually left.
Yeah. Well, first off, what you just said, I think is so beautifully said again. I think it goes back to not merely deconstructing the religion itself, but deconstructing the fear and shame that can sometimes come with it. And I think that's what everything you said really pointed to. I think that I think I grew in my awareness that I had internalized a lot of beliefs regarding looking at the world in this very binary lens. You had good versus bad, holy versus secular, everything felt very like rigid. I had internalized a lot of beliefs about myself, just about my own brokenness and my own incapability of being fully redeemed or fully seen as something that is good and of value. So I had a lot of self-worth things that I didn't realize were impacting me as shame at the time, that I later through therapy was able to unpack. And I also think too, just my framework as to how to relate to other people. My relationships, I didn't realize it at the time, were very much built around a desire to have them conform to something that I believed in. And I struggled at times to hold genuine relationships with people that were different than me, and to feel like I had something to learn from people who were different than me. And so I think those were a lot of the beliefs that I subconsciously held at the time, that through therapy, through journaling, through my own mindfulness, I feel like I've been able to work through more. And I think now, I'm kind of in a place where I realize that there's a lot more nuance in things than we sometimes like to realize, and that nuance is greatly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It's really, really scary to not have things fit in these like black and white boxes of, good versus bad and us versus them. And I think for me, as I started to peel apart these subconscious beliefs, like, I think some of the things I started to question was like, okay, if God is truly God, like, then how could I find God in things that even are different than what I was so prone to only see God in? Because I know that God is so much bigger than I could ever imagine. And I think it was in my willingness to engage in different, when I even say different beliefs, I don't even mean like completely different. Like, it could be a denomination. It could be someone who just goes to a different church than you. Like, it doesn't have to be big, but just a willingness to engage in people that maybe have a different perspective on the world, and a willingness to get curious, and a willingness to learn something from them. I think that's huge. I think that's really, really needed. And I think the continual mindfulness of like, what beliefs am I holding about myself, about the person in front of me? Are these beliefs drawing me to fear and shame, or are these beliefs drawing me to love and compassion? And I think those were the questions that were kind of like continual throughout my journey. And it's interesting because, to be honest, like in my writing, I don't really have a desire to tell people everything about what I believe, because I actually don't really think it matters. I think what matters most, and I think what deconstruction has taught me the most, is like, I just want to leave with the best example of love and compassion that I've come to know, and I want to execute that as best as possible. And so what I believe and all that, that's so secondary to like what you see in my actions,
Yeah. And I think that is a beautiful way of looking at life, is to see like, how can we be more in touch with love? And ultimately, if you look at pretty much almost any religion, there's this central core theme of a source or a God or Allah, or whatever the religion is that's they give the term to. But there's this idea of this universal energy. That's really what every teaching has at its core. And then I think, unfortunately, due to the human nature of us, as time has gone on, there have been a lot of people who have wanted to control that source or control the people who are within their, community. And therefore, this is where we sort of get some of these unhealthy or destructive behaviors surrounding trying to make a lot of rules around this. But ultimately, that source energy is love. And many of the teachings, no matter what faith you subscribe to, do come from a place of having at least one great teacher who taught from a place of love, who taught from a place of forgiveness and compassion. And so I think that it's a really beautiful message that still allows you to, keep that element, like keep the purity inside of a faith without having to necessarily subscribe to all of the extra stuff, which isn't necessarily necessary, nor is it always healthy. And I know for me, I'm still very much, I feel like you've gotten a little further than I have with some of this stuff. And perhaps, it's time that will be it for me. But right now I've found that, I haven't actually spoken about this. It's in my memoir, but I haven't actually spoken about this much at all. So when my dog died, Teddy Bear, which everyone knows is my big cataclysmic moment, that is when I started questioning my faith. And I was raised extremely fundamentalist Christian, to the point of some of the stuff that you see on like the Hollywood Story. So it came with not only this very ingrained faith routine, but it also came with a lot of rules and a lot of shame tied to it, attached to a very intense sort of caregiver who ran the show for all of the religious stuff and wasn't exactly the best role model for just regular stuff. So when I began to question after Teddy Bear passed, for me, I haven't yet re-subscribed, and maybe I never will, to anything, because I think, unfortunately for me, the term God has even been so perverted that I can no longer use that word and feel comfortable. And I remember speaking to a religious trauma coach a while back, and he said to me, sometimes you just can't rehab it. Like sometimes you can. And I think in your case, it almost feels like you have a little bit like almost rehabbed the term God for yourself and made it something different and something that feels more authentic to you. And for me, it's so broken. It's been so warped and twisted that I can't even hear that word necessarily and hear purity anymore. It's such a shame. And I tell myself that sometimes, like, oh, that's okay. Like, it doesn't have to be your word. You can use other words or other things, or you can think about things differently. It doesn't have to be that way. But I do want to encourage anybody out there, if no matter where you are in this journey, no matter where you are with your faith or with your life, you can fall within all sorts of spectrums here in terms of your faith and your belief system. You can choose to say, I want to rehab what I have, or you can choose to say, I throw out everything, and we'll see if anything ever sticks again, or if I just decide that I'm okay living in sort of the unknown place. And you mentioned, you talked about sort of the fear behind breaking down some of the beliefs. And it is really scary when you start to do that, because as you said, a lot of what religion, especially if we look just like at something like the Bible, a lot of what that is basically a box for you to live in. It's like, hey, and this is a safe place for you to be, though. And maybe I won't say box. Let me rephrase that. It's a home for you to live in. And it's like, hey, in this home, you are safe. And outside of this home, we don't know what happens outside there. So in not having a home, so to speak, when you leave that faith, when you leave those teachings, it can be really scary. And I'd love to know sort of what that felt like for you when you started, because I know you did feel some of that fear. And what did you do to manage that fear, but also to be comfortable with it. Because I know you and I both had that thing, like, you just got to get comfortable with being that place where you just don't know, like, and that's okay. And by not knowing, sometimes we give ourselves the opportunity to then, like you were talking about, have greater perspective, have more compassion for others, open up to possibilities that we didn't know existed.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much for even like, I know we had a conversation before this, so I've gotten to know more of your story, but I think even just with everything you said, I think that's so, so valid. And anyone who finds themselves even in that exact spot, like, are not alone. I've talked to so many people who have the exact same or a very similar experience, I'll say. And so thank you just for like opening that up and also like normalizing that side of the experience. I think that's important. Yeah, so like you and I have talked about the importance of getting getting comfortable with discomfort. And I think that's something that has helped me to get more comfortable with discomfort is really knowing my why, knowing my purpose behind why I am doing the thing I'm doing, whether it be, you know, questioning my belief system, or maybe sometimes it's just going to therapy. Going to therapy is uncomfortable. It's a lot of self-introspection. And I think knowing your why is so, so, so important. And I think finding people, and for me, I want to be honest, like there was a time in my life where I did not talk to anybody about the questions I was having, because where I was at, my entire community was saturated within this ideology that it didn't feel safe for me to express my thoughts on where I was with it all. So for me, I found comfort in therapy, which is, definitely a gift that I was able to do that as well. And I think that's always something that's valuable if you have the means to do it, or even in the form of mentorship, or even in the form of, there are people online who are talking about the very thing that you're struggling with, and having tangible reminders to know that you are not alone, like wherever you're at. Like, I know it can feel so isolating, but there are people out there that are having the exact same questions and the exact same doubts that you're having. And something that you really spoke to that I personally loved so much about deconstruction is that deconstruction really celebrates the diversity of, like, you can end up wherever. The point is not so much about where it is you end up on your like theology or beliefs or whatever. It's more about like, how are you living out love? How are you living out compassion? How are you living out those beliefs? And I think that's super, super important. I thought you just spoke to that so, so beautifully.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's way harder to, and it's funny because like I come on this channel, I talk about personal things with people all the time, and there's plenty of things that I've shared, especially around like pet loss and things like that, and the pain of like losing my dog, and everyone knows about that. I'm able to speak freely about that, but this is one of those things where I can already feel just in this discussion, like I'm having trouble vocalizing, I'm having trouble being clear. So I'm glad it's coming across somewhat clear, because
Yes.
I can feel that this subject for me, I haven't yet gotten off the training wheels of like how to express this, because I haven't, as you mentioned, I haven't really brought this out in public yet. And it's not something that I've talked to a lot of people about, and it's not necessarily something that I've even written much about at all. So I think that as you get your sea legs about you with some of this stuff, it definitely feels easier to converse. But in the beginning, what you may, and what I actually did earlier on when I was starting to struggle was I did a lot of writing, and I know you've done a lot of writing, Sierra, as well. I did a lot of poetry, and the poetry was like some of it was like rather dark, and very angry about some of the things that I believed about myself. And I did a lot of shamanic journeying as well. Like, so I started doing some of that work to do some, just deep diving into where did I feel like parts of me were hiding away from, away from these teachings. Like, where did I feel like I had sort of gone wrong, and I had sort of hidden that part of myself away. So I did a lot of that sort of stuff, and then I would journal afterwards. So I did a lot of writing privately, not publicly, but just in journaling and poetry. And that helped me start to see what I was really angry about in my forced belief system, because the other thing that is really interesting is some people adopt faiths later on in life. And some people are sort of like forced into it because you're raised that way, and truthfully, you don't have a choice. And then there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. I think parents a lot of times raise their children under their own faith because obviously they feel like this is a protection, this is something that's helpful. And I think that the danger in that kind of forced avenue is that you don't necessarily allow for that child to grow up thinking that they have a choice in a lot of other things. Because if they're held under these rules, and then those rules, for example, I'll just give one, like one of the 10 commandments is to listen to your parents, right? And this is a great rule, but what if your parent is dangerous? What if your parent is harmful? You're not giving your child a choice. You're not giving your child a voice. And so I think that one of the things that, as I have grown up and sort of realized like, oh, it makes sense why I never questioned this early on, because this wasn't an option to question. Oh, why did I allow myself to be in these situations? Oh, you didn't allow yourself. You had to be. Like, there wasn't really a choice here. And I think that's one of the beauties about getting older and also having access to a lot of other ways of thinking and, other people's belief systems, even within your same faith community. Just being able to see that there's more out there, and then to ask like whether or not that's something you want to partake from. And I didn't realize that I even had a choice to not believe. Like, it didn't even dawn on me. I mean, it was 30 something years, and I had never even once thought, what would it be like if I didn't subscribe to this set of rules or this, belief system? Like, I didn't even think about that. I don't know about you. Did you ever think about that you had a choice, or you didn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't think about it too deeply growing up because, just like growing up in the church, it's kind of like what you were saying. It makes me think about, I feel like when you're a kid, you find, understandably so much comfort and safety within like systems and structures and like boxes per se. And I think parents often will provide that for their kids out of like just wanting to give them a sense of direction, which is needed for kids, 100%. I think where adulthood gets to be difficult is when the time comes that you start to not necessarily find safety in systems and structures, but like, how do you find safety within yourself? Because sometimes you're not taught that when you're a kid, when the emphasis is so much upon your identity within religion, your identity as whatever it is, you lose a sense of like, I was never really taught how to be okay with like a changing of my own beliefs, and that wasn't something that meant any wrong thing about me, that I was allowed to detach from certain beliefs, that I was, like those kind of things. I feel like as you get older, you start to learn, you ideally hope to learn, what is it like to find safety within yourself rather than systems and structures. And that's a really, really difficult place to be.
Yeah, it is. It's really scary. And I think, and it does take a lot of sort of like mental muscle power and also just like heart muscle power to sit with that for a while, like you said, because it is really uncomfortable. And one of the things, which is kind of piggybacking off what you just said, that I found was that I had put and this is natural, I put so much stock in an outside entity. And for me, that entity was conditioned to be masculine and was conditioned to be someone who had like both a very kind hand, but also a very cruel hand if you were bad. There was like the punishment, and then there was like the praise. And depending on your behavior and how good or bad you were, that's like what indicated that. And so you always lived with this sense of fear that like if you did something wrong, if you made mistakes, it was like suddenly, oh my God, I'm a bad person. Now I have to repent for that. Now I'm okay though, because I've gotten the blessing, or I've gotten the, I've been baptized again, or I've had hands laid on me, or whatever it might be. And so there was never this ability to just make a mistake and like learn from it. There was just always this added pressure of, needing to follow this specific path. And also realizing that, afterwards, when I really sort of walked away from all of that stuff, is that I had a lot more power than I thought. I think that one of the things that, unfortunately happens sometimes within these, like you said, institutionalized ways of faith, is that the idea is to take the power from the people and to put it into centralized figures instead of the powers in each person. And this is something that just changed my whole life, and it changed the way I lived life, and it changed the way I saw myself, and therefore the way I saw other people. Was I really felt like, wow, I actually have a lot more agency
Hmm.
inside me to make choices, to do things. I also have a lot more worth, just as me, the person, just being here breathing, as opposed to being here for some other entity, which was how I was raised, was that I was basically here. And again, this is not a blanket statement for all religion. This is how I was raised. I was raised to believe that I am here because I'm supposed to do this thing for this entity, whatever that good service is that I'm doing. I'm supposed to be good, and if I can do that till the end, then I can go to this other place that's really great. But if I'm not good, then there's this other place that I go if I'm bad. And all the people I love, if they're not on my side, they go to this bad place. And if they are on my side, they go to this beautiful place. And
Right.
ultimately, you know, I'm always looking to this higher entity to save me, to help me, to fix me, to heal me. And I didn't realize that for me personally, that had meant that I didn't feel like alone I was worth anything, because I always felt like I was only worth something to this bigger being that was masculine. And there
Hmm.
was for me a lot of things that I grew up with that were basically like masculine in the religious world was better than feminine. And therefore, as a female, you were just always bad because you were the Eve that ate the apple. And therefore, you were just the sinner forever. And there were a lot of things now that you were going to pay for, in order to make that up to your male counterparts who you ruined everything for. So again, this is only my specific way of being raised. It's not everybody's, but because of these specific belief systems, it really did lend itself to then, me looking at my life as a servant. I'm basically a servant to men. I'm a servant to this entity. And I wasn't unhappy in that servant role, because to me at the time that's the role. I became unhappy when I got into my teens, and then like felt a little bit angsty about it. But it really wasn't until after my dog died and I began addressing death, and then like what happens after death, and how I didn't want to believe certain things I was raised to believe, that I ended up saying, well, wait, there's a lot of other things here I can unpack. And in doing that, like you said, it leads to a lot of uncertainty. And in the beginning, that was very frightening, to be like, well, now if there's no being in the sky that's looking out for me, well, who is?
Yeah, no,
Well,
100%.
like it's just, so I think it's really interesting to, you know, to allow yourself, like you said, to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and
Mhm.
to know that it's okay to not have answers. And I think for me, one of the most freeing things that I've experienced in deconstructing my own life and leaving organized religion is that I am now free to not believe in anything if I don't want to.
Mhm.
It's a lot less pressure, because now you can meet someone with love and say, oh, you believe that? That's cool. You don't have to fight them on it.
It's
And you
not.
don't have to, right. And you don't have to have everything answered, which is also a huge weight in having like all the answers for the universe. And I love having the mystery. Don't you? Don't you love having the mystery?
Yes,
You don't
100.
know why something is the way it is, and you're just like, that's cool.
Yes. Well, I think deconstruction really taught me that even if I had all the answers, I still don't know. Like that's part of what faith is too. And so
Yeah.
like leading, and that's why I think deconstruction was an expression of faith, because it's like the understanding that no matter what answers I come to, none of us really know. We all think that we have the closest grasp on truth. That's just human. We all think
Right.
that we know,
Right.
but at the end of the day, none of us 100% know. And that's part of the beauty of it, like the mystery of that.
Yeah. And the mystery of life, I think it lends itself then that we can find more joy in things, because
Yeah.
we're not always putting up these blinders of like, this is the way it is. And so I can't see anything past this. Meanwhile, there could be a lot of beauty that you're missing, or joy that you're missing because of that. Tell me about if there's any sort of lingering wounds that you still have from that time. Because I know I've got plenty that I'm still like, I just sort of sit with. And we don't have to fix everything. So, where are those wins for you, and how do you sort of manage them, or do you? And then what kinds of questions are you constantly asking yourself to kind of keep staying
Yeah.
within this deconstruction place?
That's such a good question. Yeah, I would say I think the wounds that come up for me, I think there's two that come to mind. One, I think I, to this day, still bend towards struggling a lot with self-trust. Like I second guess myself more than anyone probably second guesses me. And I've gotten a lot better at that. But I think that I internalized for a long time that trusting myself was like dangerous, that it wasn't okay, that I was always going to lead myself astray, to not trust my or to not even really acknowledge like my feelings. Like my feelings were bad. And, I had all these like really binary negative internalizations. So I think self-trust is something I've grown a lot in, and it's something I still have so much more work and healing to do. And I'm really excited for that. But I think one of the wounds that for sure most deeply I am left with, which is that when I left the church, even not even the ideologies that I once clung to completely, I lost a lot of people in my life. And I didn't lose them by means of having an honest conversation. Sometimes I lost people because they just conversations that were had without me present, that were very much concerned about my salvation and concerned about, those conversations hurt. And so I think that I've had people in my life that they were loving me the best they know how. And I have to remember that. I think that frees me from a lot of anger and bitterness that I could at this point still cultivate for those people. But it still was really painful the way that people were loving me at that time. And so, I cut people out of my life. People cut me out of their life. I think that loss of belonging, all of a sudden, when it's so many people at one time, it really sticks with you, like when something like that happens. And I think that for me, what that's turned into, as I have done a lot of healing work, is I think that I do still have a tendency to like not totally trust people's intentions. Like I find myself still questioning their intentions. And I don't like that part about myself. It's something that I'm very aware of. And in some ways, I think it's good. I think, in some ways, I'm like, that's just my body wanting to keep me safe, of just like, I want to make sure that people are like really here for what they say they're here for.
Yeah.
So part of it, I think, is so good. And I'm so grateful for that part of me. And the other part of it can sometimes go a little bit too far, where I'm like, okay, but at what point have like, people shouldn't always have to bend over backwards to prove themselves to me. Like that's not fair either. So I think that's one of the things that I find myself still working through. But yeah, what about for you? I'm curious to know, like, what wounds do you feel
I
like
definitely share your mistrust of people. I think that's something I definitely share. And that's both from religious trauma, sexual abuse, and a whole host of other things. So I definitely do have that mistrust thing, that I'm more wary of people than I was before. So it's something I work on as well. And I think that part of that, working on that, comes from that self-intuition, that self-worth, because like you were talking about before, if you can be in tune with your body, like when you don't feel like you're fighting with your own self all the time, then you feel like you can trust your own judgment a little bit more, and you can really tap into like, okay, so what's here? Is this an old fear, or is this an actual, like, there's some evidence here that actually proves why this person doesn't feel trustworthy to me, or why I need more time to trust this person. And then just redefining trust for myself too, and what that means was really helpful. I did that also in therapy. I didn't really realize what trust. It's so funny. In therapy, you learn like all these basic words, like what's trust, what's safety, what's intimacy. Meanwhile, you're raised to believe all these things are very different. And then you're like, oh, actually, that's what that means. Oh, wow, I've been doing that wrong. So yeah, I think that's one of the things for me. Another thing that I think I'm still working on is just trusting, like in that same realm, trusting like any kind of belief or belief system. And maybe I never will. Maybe I will always be. I call myself right now like a spiritual skeptic, or a spiritual scientist, where I'm like, I'm very pro understanding like how the brain works, and then understanding how the brain processes things like faith, and like why does it feel good, and what's going on in our nervous system, and why does that. Why when we go into like, let's say a church service and we listen to the music, and why does that feel good? Like, why do we feel like we're almost high doing that? And then we leave Sunday, when you always feel great, and you get these, the preacher did something and you're like, oh, it just feels so good. Like, what was it about that? So I like understanding the science behind why that feels good. Because to me that's comforting, although science is not always right either, so I've also got that part of my brain is turned on to like, okay, so sometimes science is wrong too. But even after I tried a lot of other practices and I got really for a little while into like the spiritualist community, and I was doing a lot of like psychic work and mediumship and doing all these things that I was told were witchcraft and was going to, bring the devil into my life. And uh, it was really interesting to just like go sort of off the deep end over there and just do the thing that I was told I'm never allowed to do. And it was fun for a while, but then I also began to notice similar things, similar patterns. And I was like, oh, actually, I don't want to be in here. And I think for me right now, one of the things that I have gone through that's a wound still is like the grief over not having a faith, like not having a one thing that I can claim. So like I thought it was going to be this spiritual avenue, and I met all these great people. And while I still like love dabbling in things like tarot cards and stuff, I can't let myself fully subscribe to it. And it's one of the reasons why I don't do it professionally, because I'm like, I don't believe fully. There's a part of me that is like, yeah, okay, you sit back on this, because if you let yourself be in this wholeheartedly, you could end up with blinders on. And so I think that for me, it feels like I grieve a lot, that innocence of latching on to something and just saying, oh my God, this feels so good. Constantly questioning like that, it's not that it takes all the fun out of something, but it does give you, how do I want to put this? Maybe you can help me, Sierra. When you question something a lot, it's like you don't get a chance to like fall into it all the way. You're like,
yeah, you don't get a chance to like, well, I think the word you used earlier that I really appreciated was like, there's like this sweet innocence that comes when you are like fully submersed in something, like anything. There's this sweet innocence because there's like a sense of belonging, there's a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, like everything is like really laid out for you. And like, all you got to do is follow. Like that's all you got to do.
Yeah.
And it's a lot less, it's so much more simple like that.
Yes. Simplistic nature. I think that's what it was I was looking for. It's like the easy to digest simplistic nature of it. And once you start to really, continue to question, you continue to be curious about like, what's the motivation here? What's this? It's almost like you become a little more analytical about everything, and you don't fall head over heels in love. You're kind of always a little far removed. So I think for me, that's one of the things like that I still grieve, is not having that head over heels innocence that falls into something.
And I resonate with that wholeheartedly. Yeah,
because it does feel good. And there's a nervous system reason why that feels good. And I think that's one of the things that's actually helped me is understanding like what's going on in the nervous system, in the brain, that allows that to feel so good. And then just understanding, okay, so that's a lot of like hormonal things that are going on and a lot of things that are being discharged in your brain that make you feel so good. You can actually have those experiences doing other things, or, being out in nature, or letting yourself fall in love with a moment, or, a scent for a moment, like, kind of just living really presently and richly in everyday life, and getting that same intoxication from that, as opposed to within a structure or an organization or something like that. And this can go for, anything. I was really involved with fostering dogs for a while. And as much as I like absolutely champion fostering dogs and the cause, sometimes in those organizations, you can also have the same, like very binary and like not a lot of dialogue and heavy handedness. And so there can sometimes be that, and again, not always, can sometimes be the same, like falling head over heels. I'm feeling so good about your mission and your passion and what you're fighting, but then losing sight sometimes of like the core and the love and the compassion and the forgiveness and things like that. If somebody is interested in beginning to deconstruct, whether it's religion or anything in their lives, because this really applies to anything, how do they go about those beginning phases? What kind of questions are they asking, and where are they going, whether for support or for more resources and knowledge on this stuff?
Well, I love that you mentioned that, because deconstruction, the way that I talk about it, it really is something that expands far beyond religion. Like it's not just merely about religion. It can be like a posture in a way that you approach life. whether it be in regards to just the way you relate to other people, politics, and just the societal conditioning that you've been handed. Like deconstruction can apply to everything. It does not have to be a religion. I think deconstruction really starts with a curiosity as to like, what is it that you currently believe? And do you really believe it? Or is that just something that's been handed to you? I think it's a lot of self-introspection. Like for me, my favorite way to self-introspect is through journaling. Journaling is my favorite practice, but that's not always how it is for, everyone. I've been coaching some people who don't particularly love journaling, and that's so okay. There's people that have really enjoyed just going on nature walks and like mindfulness walks. And so finding a practice that feels good for you, where you feel like you have the ability to just like be so honest with yourself. Like one of my favorite journal prompts that I just use for myself sometimes is like, what are some things that I'm so scared to say out loud right now, but I feel are true?
Oh, that's
Like
really good.
those things, like what are things I'm lying to myself about right now? What are things I'm not being completely honest with myself? What are things I wouldn't want anyone else to read on this paper? I think just getting really, really curious is like the first step, and getting really aware as to what it is you believe and really why you believe it. And to think about are these beliefs something that are adding value to my life, or are they bringing on the fear and shame? Are they bringing on disconnection within myself or within other people and my relationships? And so the context to do it in, I think it varies from person to person. And I think it also varies based on your experience, because I think for some people, doing that in the context of therapy is the way to do it, because there can be a lot of trauma that gets brought up in this space, in which I want to say that like therapy and counseling, like that is the means in which I would always recommend somebody do that processing with, because those are people who that's within their scope, and those are people that have studied for years to hold space for you in that. I think if you're in a place where you don't necessarily feel like you have to process through all the deep trauma and you're just looking to like move forward, coaching and mentorship can be such a great place for that. It's a very like forward action moving process, but also you don't even need any of that. You can do it just by yourself. You can do it in the means of your journal, or you can do it, just through prioritizing that self-introspection. I think a practice that I still hold within my life that to me, I don't think I'm ever going to let go of, is listening to people who I disagree with. And I don't even mean like, for me, that is oftentimes held in the context of there are podcasts I listen to and YouTube channels, commentary people that I listen to that I don't agree with, but I find value in just allowing myself to hear their perspective and to always hold a posture of like, maybe there's something that I can learn from this person. Maybe it's just deepening my own perspective. Like that might be all that it is.
Yeah.
But just always holding the posture that there is no person that I don't want to at least hold capacity to like really listen. It doesn't have to change my mind, but just being able to listen, not for the point of trying to prove them wrong, or like just to listen. And so I think a practice that can be really helpful is like, when was the last time you listened to a podcast of somebody you just don't agree with? When was the last time you listened to a YouTube channel or had a conversation with somebody on something that you have differing opinions on, and your goal was not to prove them wrong, but just to listen? Another very easy way that I think someone could do this, like if you're listening and that already feels like too much, one of my favorite YouTube channels, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a YouTube channel called Middle Ground.
No, I haven't heard that one.
Okay, I recommend it to everyone. Essentially, the concept of the channel is the producers bring in like 10 people, 5 people on both sides have totally differing opinions on like a very controversial or like very current subject matter. And essentially the producer reads out prompts and people will come to the middle of the room if they agree or disagree. And they just talk about why they agree or why they disagree. And the prompts are not so much about what it is they believe, but more so about their experience. So the prompts could be like, I have felt like the other side hasn't totally understood where I'm coming from, or like, I have lost friendships because of this. And like people just like come to the middle and they just talk about the middle ground that they both experience. And I think that's like a really beautiful place to start, because you can really see how people who have differing opinions on things can still find a sense of connection and still find a sense of relationship. And I think more often than not, like that is where the change is had. It's like in our connection with people, and our willingness to listen and engage and to hold space for people, like that not only changes people, but it changes us. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Oh, that's like so beautiful. And I totally agree with the listening and making that a really big cornerstone of what you're ingesting when you are trying to look at different perspectives or listen to people and what they have to say, what their experiences have been. I love that. I'll put the link to that podcast, everybody, in the comments here, so you can check that out. I'll have to check out one of those for sure. And I also just love the idea of people letting go of that need to prove, because I think, like you were saying, from our experiences and on a neuroscience level, mostly when we have an opinion about something, it's because our brain has basically cataloged a series of evidence that it feels we have this, and this is what justifies us, and this is why we have this opinion. And so it can be really hard for our brain to even want to absorb anything or be capable of absorbing anything if it has those strong reasonings, because it's sort of like always filtering for something that's important. And to the brain, it's sort of like, that doesn't feel important because we already have all this evidence that goes for this. And so in order to kind of like hack that system, you do have to come from a place of curiosity, as you mentioned earlier, because if the brain is curious, then it is more likely to be open. It is more likely to absorb. It is more likely to really listen and get the facts of that. Otherwise, it's more likely to pick out the places where it sees the ability to dominate, or the places where it sees the ability, and this is just like natural biology, the places where, so it doesn't matter if you're a good person, bad person, doesn't matter, anything between, your brain is doing this. Where can it dominate, and what parts of this conversation can it take now and use as food in order to show why this opinion works? And it's a wonderful system, the brain, but it also has its limitations, and this is one of them. So I love the idea of listening and really being open to listening. And I know for me, like there's definitely been things that now I listen to where I'm open to that before there's no way I would have even touched. Like there's no way I would have even listened to that person or observed any of their content, because I would have been like, oh my God, that's not in alignment with anything. But meanwhile, there's a lot of common ground there, at middle ground. There's a lot of common ground in terms of those core beliefs of like love, compassion, forgiveness. And I think one of the things we talked about when we spoke privately was how a lot of times with this deconstruction, we actually get closer to the source of that love that all of these institutions, religions, organizations are basically trying to initially give us, but we're able to actually get closer to the purity of those teachings by doing a lot of this deconstruction work. Because when we're in a place where we're, being guided by rules as opposed to being guided by, some of this other more, I'd say like maybe authentic stuff, we put blinders on, we lose the ability to hear other people. We lose the ability to connect with other people that are not on our side or whatever it might be. And so we are able to be, I think we have a greater capacity for love, as you said. So
Yeah.
I love that in a way, like we get to be closer to that feeling. And I know actually more now than ever, I have felt like sort of the universal love aspect of things more fully in my body than I did when I had all these other beliefs, just because I'm more open to myself. I'm more loving of myself. I'm more loving of other people. I'm like less fearful. And so I don't live in as much fear, and I don't cling to as many things. And it also means that a lot less things can be taken from me. Because if you don't say this has to be the way it is, then nobody can come in and prove you wrong. No one can come in and take it away. And you're kind of taking it away for yourself and saying, well, actually, I'm going to take it away and then see what happens. So I think it's a really cool, deconstruction is a really cool thing to play with, even if you're not ready to go like full throttle the way Sierra and I have done. It's okay. There's baby steps, and there's different places in your life where you may find deconstruction to be helpful, and other places in your life where like, I don't want to touch that, and that's fine. So I just think being curious and exploratory is definitely sort of step one. And then from there, you can work with someone wonderful like Sierra to help you the rest of the way. And Sierra, what do you sort of want people to know at the end of this show about, everything we've talked about? What's like the one takeaway you really want people to kind of remember?
I guess the one takeaway would just be that, curiosity is good. Your curiosity is always good, no matter where that leads. And yeah, it's not dangerous. It's good. So wherever that leads you, it is honored and celebrated. So
love that. Honored and celebrated. And I will put all in the recordings, in the comments, excuse me, places where people can find you. But where can people find you if they want to connect with you, work with you?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram at itssierrascott. I also have a podcast called Real Talk Tuesday, which I'd love to have you part of at some point for sure. I haven't started interview episodes yet because it kind of intimidates me. So I very much admire that you're already doing it. So I'm going to get over that leap. And then, yes. But yeah, you can find me on the Real Talk Tuesday podcast. And yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. I hope you all found this to be helpful, and have a great rest of your day. We'll see you back here soon again with Gloria. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, guys.